one. The bread you're chewing, if you're imagining it now, probably tastes sour. Not sourdough in a boutique bakery kind of sour, but the tang of grain that was never fully clean, never fully dry. Sometimes it had mold speckles. Sometimes it didn't bake all the way through. That didn't matter. You didn't throw bread away, not unless you were rich enough to waste food, which you aren't. The wealthy had the luxury of manchet, fine white bread made from sifted wheat flour. It was soft, light, and expensive. Meanwhile, you gnaw on maslin, a peasant mix of wheat, rye, barley, and oats that bakes into something chewy, dark, and about as exciting as cardboard soaked in vinegar. And yet, there's something almost sacred about this bread. In many households, it's the one guaranteed constant. Everything else, meat, fish, vegetables, depends on season and fortune. But bread is the baseline. People believed bread carried a kind of divine protection. That's why bakers faced harsh punishments if caught cheating customers with underweight loaves. In England, the assize of bread and ale, basically a medieval consumer protection law, set strict rules. If your baker was cutting corners, authorities could tie him to his own oven door and drag him through the streets. So yes, medieval justice wasn't just about knights and castles. It was about bread weight. Now imagine yourself sitting at that rough table again, tearing off a piece. You notice something odd. The bread is baked in thick, flat rounds. Later, as you join others at supper, these rounds will double as plates. They're called trenchers, thick slabs of bread that catch gravy, stew, and anything greasy enough to drip. At the end of the meal, the trencher is either eaten, fed to dogs, or given to the poo.
You push the pot of stew aside, licking the last broth off your fingers, and then your eyes drift to something rarer. Meat. Not the thick, juicy steak you might picture when you think of a medieval feast, but something far humbler. Maybe a bony chicken leg, maybe a stringy rabbit, maybe a salted hunk of pork that looks more gray than pink. Meat, in the Middle Ages, was not your everyday friend. It was a luxury, an occasional guest at the table, and when it showed up, it often brought trouble along with it. You stare at the piece in front of you, wondering whether to risk it. Fresh meat was never as fresh as you'd like. Remember, there are no refrigerators here. Animals had to be slaughtered quickly, usually in the cooler months when you had a fighting chance of keeping the meat longer. In summer, unless you ate it almost immediately, it spoiled fast. You could try salting it, smoking it, or hanging it in a cold cellar, but the truth was, preservation was more of an art than a science. Some batches worked, others just gave you stomach cramps that lasted for days. Historians still argue whether most peasants ate meat more than a handful of times each year. On feast days, sure. On a Sunday, maybe. But for your average week, not likely. Nobles and the wealthy ate far more, their diets dripping with venison, boar, and roasted fowl. You, on the other hand, would be lucky to get a slice of bacon to flavor your stew, or some marrow bones to gnaw on. In fact, bacon fat was sometimes treated as a seasoning in itself, rubbed onto bread or melted into porridge for a hint of something rich. Imagine being so deprived of meat that bacon grease alone feels like a delicacy. You pick up a knife, dull, uneven, and cut into the meat. The smell rises quickly, and you hesitate. Is that smokiness, or something else? One quirky tidbit here. Medieval cooks often used vinegar and strong sauces to disguise the taste of meat that was going off. Recipes from the time are full of sour, spiced gravies that weren't necessarily there to taste good, but to cover the fact that your roast goose had been dead a little too long. Even nobles weren't immune. Just because you lived in a castle didn't mean your kitchen had a freezer. And speaking of disguises, sometimes it got downright bizarre. There are records of elaborate feasts where the chef would sew a cooked bird back into its feathers or disguise one animal as another. A chicken might be made to look like a porcupine, bristling with almonds for quills. Was it tasty? Debatable? Was it impressive? Definitely. Meanwhile, at your table, you're chewing on a piece of mutton that tastes faintly like wet wool. But here's where meat really became tricky: disease. Livestock in the Middle Ages weren't exactly raised in the pristine conditions you might imagine from a farm commercial. They were scrawny, often underfed, sometimes sick. Parasites were common. Pork, in particular, could carry worms if undercooked, and without thermometers, undercooked happened a lot. Imagine taking a bite, only to find yourself feeling feverish a week later. It's not just blandness you're battling, it's survival. There's a famous debate among scholars. Were peasants truly excluded from meat? Or did they find more clever ways to access it? Some argue that hunting, while often restricted by law, still provided the occasional rabbit or bird for the poor. Others suggest that illicit poaching was widespread enough to keep at least a little meat in circulation. Records exist of peasants being punished harshly for snaring deer or boar in the king's forest. So if you want meat, you risk a fine, or worse. Tonight's chicken might be the result of a neighbor's quiet poaching, shared under whispered promises that nobody saw anything. And yet, when you finally chew through that sinewy bite, something primal stirs. Even bland, even questionable meat was power. It was strength. In some medieval belief systems, eating too much meat was thought to infly.
The fish finally settles in your stomach, leaving behind that faint seawater aftertaste. And now your eyes drift to the garden patch outside the hut. If you were hoping for color or variety, prepare to be disappointed. Vegetables in the Middle Ages weren't the dazzling rainbow you might see stacked in a modern supermarket aisle. No bell peppers in glossy reds and yellows, no bright orange carrots that crunch sweetly in your mouth. Instead, you're looking at a patch of soil where stubborn roots and leafy greens struggle through the mud. Cabbages, turnips, onions, leeks. These are your daily companions, plain, dependable, and as thrilling as a wet sock. You tug up a turnip from the earth, brushing off the dirt with your sleeve. It smells sharp, peppery, almost bitter. This is dinner. Maybe you'll boil it until it softens into a mush. Maybe you'll toss it into the perpetual stew. Either way, it won't transform into anything magical. It's fuel, not flavor. Medieval people understood vegetables as necessary fillers, not centerpieces. They kept your belly from aching, but nobody wrote ballads about a particularly inspiring cabbage. Historians still argue whether peasants genuinely disliked vegetables or whether they were simply too familiar to get excited about. After all, the wealthy often turned up their noses at them, calling them peasant food. Yet the same nobles happily ate peas, beans, and greens when other dishes weren't available. You, however, don't have the luxury of choice. Tonight it's cabbage again. Tomorrow, probably cabbage again. The day after? Surprise, it's still cabbage. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval carrots weren't even orange. That iconic color only became widespread much later, after selective breeding in the Netherlands. Your carrot is likely pale, whitish, maybe even purplish, and not particularly sweet. You bite into one and taste a woody bitterness, like chewing on flavored bark. Not exactly the crunchy snack you imagine from your lunchbox. The cabbages don't fare much better. They're tough, dense, and smell faintly sulfurous when boiled. Imagine a kitchen filled with the steam of overcooked cabbage day after day. It seeps into your clothes, your bedding, even your hair. You carry the scent of vegetables everywhere, whether you like it or not. No wonder medieval inns probably smelled more like boiled greens than roasted meats. And yet, vegetables had their place. They filled the gaps left by bread and stew. Peas and beans were especially important, rich in protein. They made up for the lack of meat in a peasant's diet. You can almost feel your teeth grinding through a bowl of pea porridge, thick, green, and lumpy, with the occasional burst of a whole pea that somehow resisted boiling. Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, the old rhyme goes. Yes, it was real. You might eat it fresh from the pot or scrape it cold the next morning. Either way, it was the same monotonous bowl of green mush. Vegetables weren't just food, they were medicine too, or so people thought. Garlic and onions were praised for keeping away illness. Cabbage leaves were sometimes used as poultices. Leeks were thought to cleanse the blood. It's one of those medieval beliefs historians still argue about. Did these folk remedies actually help, or were they just comforting traditions passed along generations? You, chewing your leek, don't have the luxury of scientific studies. You just hope the old sayings are right. And then there's the matter of seasoning. Without spices, without much salt, vegetables tasted exactly as they were. Earthy, bitter, and bland. You toss a pinch of herbs in, parsley if you've got some, dill or fennel if the garden was kind, but the effect is mild at best. Most of the time, you're eating a bowl of mushy greens with a hunk of bread to scoop it up. Your jaw moves automatically, your mind drifting elsewhere. Think about this. In some regions, people believed cabbages could prevent drunkenness. The trick you've settled into the daily grind of bread and porridge, but the moment you wander past the manor or the castle kitchens, you catch a whiff of something strange, sharp, fragrant, almost intoxicating. It's the smell of spices. And here's the kicker, you'll probably never taste them. For nobles, spices are the glittering jewels of the dining table. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, imported treasures carried along trade routes that stretch across deserts and seas. To sprinkle a little cinnamon on your meat or dust your wine with nutmeg is more than seasoning. It's a flex. It says, "Look at me. I'm so wealthy I can literally eat imported tree bark." You, meanwhile, gnawing your bland rye bread, can only imagine what meat might taste like if it weren't grey and boiled. Historians still argue whether medieval cooks used spices to cover up the taste of spoiled meat or simply because they genuinely loved the flavors. Spoiler: meat was too expensive to let spoil on purpose, so the covering rot theory doesn't hold up. Instead, think of spices like Instagram filters, ways for the wealthy to make their meals look and taste a little more impressive, even if the core dish was the same boiled stuff as yours. Pepper is the superstar. Tiny black seeds carried from India, worth their weight in silver. Imagine being so valuable that kings hoard you in locked chests. Then there's saffron, which dyes dishes a brilliant golden yellow. You don't even need much, just a few strands, and suddenly your bread pudding looks like liquid sunshine. Cinnamon, shipped in from faraway Ceylon, transforms wine into mulled comfort. And cloves? They're like little explosions of heat in your mouth, exotic and mysterious. Meanwhile, your seasonings are, let's say, rustic. A pinch of salt if you're lucky, a handful of onions, maybe garlic if the mood strikes. You stir it into your stew and pretend it's just as fancy. It isn't, but you tell yourself it fills the same role, hiding the blandness of yet another cabbage and barley mush. There's also a quirky twist. Spice was a way to show off not just wealth but power. Feasts became theatre. Picture this. You're a peasant serving in the hall, and the Lord's table glows with golden saffron rice, studded with raisins and dripping with honey. The smells are intoxicating. You can barely swallow your saliva as you pass plates of venison seasoned with pepper and cloves. You watch your lord smile smugly as the guests gasp, because really no one cares what the venison tastes like. They care that he can afford spices worth more than your entire year's wages. But here's the tragic part. You too will encounter spice. Once in a blue moon. Maybe at Christmas or Easter, when the village priest blesses a special loaf spiked with cinnamon or nutmeg. You take one bite, and it's like your taste buds wake up from a year-long nap. Sweet, fragrant, almost otherworldly. And then it's gone, leaving you with another 11 months of turnip stew. The debate among scholars is fun. Did spices trickle down to peasants at all? Some evidence suggests small amounts of pepper or saffron sometimes found their way into lower-class kitchens, but most historians agree it was rare. More likely you got your kick from herbs, parsley, sage or dill plucked from the garden. Fresh, yes. Exotic, no. Still, when you sprinkle a handful into your bubbling pot, you tell yourself, it's close enough. Every now and then spices also sneak into medicine. Pepper poultices, cinnamon tonics, saffron teas. They're all prescribed as cures for anything from stomach aches to melancholy. Do they work? Well, historians still argue whether medieval doctors actually believed in their healing power, or if it was another excuse to use something rare and costly. Either way, if you're sick, you're more likely chewing willow bark than sipping spiced wine. So you sit at your table staring at your bowl of mush, and you imagine what it must feel like to eat golden rice that smacks your lips, wishing for something sweet to cut through all that barley and cabbage. But here's the hard truth. Sweetness is not for you. In the Middle Ages, sugar is a luxury, a shimmering treasure carried across deserts and seas, arriving in Europe at a price that makes your eyes water more than the taste itself. For most people, it simply doesn't exist. Instead, You get honey, sticky, golden, pulled from hives carefully tended in wooden skeps or hollowed-out logs. Honey You hold a steaming bowl close and the smell hits you. Herbs, roots, something earthy and bitter. This isn't dinner. This is medicine, though in the Middle Ages, medicine and food often overlap so much you can barely tell the difference. When you're sick, your local healer doesn't prescribe pills. Instead, they hand you a concoction made from plants pulled out of gardens, forests, or monastery plots. Sage, garlic, thyme. Sometimes they're flavoring, sometimes they're treatment, and sometimes they're both. You sip the brew, hoping it helps, even though it tastes like someone boiled a meadow. Garlic, for instance, is a go-to cure for nearly everything. It's crushed into pastes for wounds, stuffed into food to cleanse the blood, or chewed raw to ward off plague. And if you reek of it afterward, all the better. People believe the smell itself drives away sickness. To you, it mostly drives away friends. Historians still argue whether medieval diets made people healthier or sicker. On one hand, simple grains and vegetables meant less cholesterol than modern fast food. On the other, the constant malnutrition and risk of spoiled food meant your body was always on edge. And when illness struck, treatments were as likely to harm you as heal you. Quirky tidbit: powdered ground-up emeralds were sometimes recommended as a cure for stomach troubles. Imagine trying to swallow crushed gemstones, gritty, expensive, and utterly useless. Nobles might try it. You? You stick with garlic and prayers. Doctors, when you can afford them, love to talk about the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. If you're sick, it means one humour is out of balance. The cure? Maybe fasting. Maybe a diet of bland porridge. Or maybe leeches. Food itself becomes part of the treatment, shifting what you're allowed to eat or drink depending on your imbalance. So you slurp the bitter broth, chew on dried herbs, and hope. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But in your world, every bite of food could be nourishment, medicine, or poison, and you never know which until it's too late. You sit at the edge of a long, groaning table, eyes wide at the sight before you. Platters piled high with roasted meats, glazed pies, shimmering jellies, and flagons of spiced wine. This is no ordinary meal. This is a feast, and in the Middle Ages, feasts are less about food and more about power. If you're lucky enough to be in the hall of a noble, you watch as servants parade whole animals roasted on spits, sometimes dressed up to look alive again. A swan might appear on the table with its feathers reattached, like some macabre decoration. A boar might arrive with an apple in its mouth, tusks polished, the skin gleaming. The flavors, ironically, are often unimpressive. After days of preparation, much of the seasoning is just heavy salt, pepper, and cinnamon, blandness wrapped in spectacle. Meanwhile, you, at the far end of the table, get the scraps. Nobles eat the prime cuts, dripping fat and tender flesh. You gnaw on gristle, crusts, and whatever falls from their trenchers. The trenchers themselves are thick slabs of stale bread used as plates. When they soak through with grease and sauce, they're handed down to the poor who happily eat them. Imagine a soggy sponge of salt and meat juice. That's your dinner. Historians still argue whether spices were truly abundant or just symbolic. Nobles flaunted cinnamon, saffron, and pepper like treasure, but the sheer cost meant many recipes were more about showing off than actually pleasing the palate. You suspect the nobles care less about taste than about dazzling their guests with exotic imports. Quirky tidbit: sometimes sugar is used not as sweetness but as decoration. Entire castles of hardened sugar, sculpted and painted, grace banquet tables. They're admired more than eaten, though children sometimes sneak bites. To your tired stomach, the idea of wasting sugar on architecture feels almost criminal. And yet, despite a